It'd be good if I grabbed the microphone, huh? I'm going to edit that out of this video. This is what happens when you're thinking about 10 things at once all the time. Yeah, you'll be doing one thing, but you'll be thinking very deeply and in deep thought about something, or multiple other things. I grew up being given like IBM junk, like stuff that was in the dumpster, and like some of my earliest toys were, these slightly broken items, and I'd tear them apart, and I'd figure out what each component did. And I also, too, grew up with, at the earliest age, with incredible fascination on light devices. The earliest recollection I could have are prisms hanging in the window. And, of course, the spectrum. Every child, by the way, should have a nice fancy prism in the window. So there'd be that portal of the day where the light would hit the prism and come into its constituent components. Of course, a superficial person, as well as a child, will just acknowledge it as pretty, which of course it is. A deeper mind, which of course hopefully your child has one, and should be inspired to ask questions about things. It's like, why does that happen? How is it that this white light breaks up into all these constituent components? So the real question is, what is light? One of the wonderful characteristics that I have, which is certainly not my looks and all this tattoo ink all over me, right, or the fact that I'm bald and fat, that I had at an early age, was I never believed my teachers. I knew they were all completely full of it. They had no clue whatsoever. And they were just parroting the same stuff that they were taught to parrot. This is what it is, and teach this stuff. Like, okay. I knew they were wrong. Not only that, even superficial examination as to the nature of light just shows how completely idiotic, if you listen to the words, what people are actually saying, and you can examine it closely, you can see that it's just complete rubbish. Everything that we think we understand about light is completely wrong. Some of this stuff, actually, and I didn't get it from him, it's the reason why I latched on to and digitized the works of Walter Russell, is that he said a few of these things, he said that light does not travel. And he did give some accurate descriptions of light. He didn't actually, explain light. He only used the word ether like twice in all his voluminous works. But he was right about a few things. Now, a superficial person, or the average person, I take that back, upon hearing such a thing, having been taught this stuff in college and high school and junior high, say, well, that's just ridiculous. Well, it's just crazy talk. What have you been drinking? What do you mean light doesn't travel? Light is not moving from point A to point B. Sure it is. Sure light's an emission. What do you mean it's not an emission? But nobody ever questions this. All they're doing is parroting the same stuff that they were taught to believe. Well, my professor's a PhD in physics. Surely he knows more than you do. That's the other nonsense that I hear. Anyway, I grew up with prisms and all sorts of... Actually, one of my earliest kits was building and soldering a power supply for a helium neon laser. I've actually done that on several lasers. Thinking about light intensely. And I knew what all these people, these, I should say, clowns, were saying was complete and utter rubbish. Of course, as human beings, we're only access to, with our eyes, an extremely small spectrum of light. We have radio and gamma radiation and X-ray and on and on and on and on. The electromagnetic spectrum is absolutely huge. But light is not a particle. There's no such thing as a photon, by the way. That's a conceptual abstraction dreamt up by atomists. Yes, to a hammer, everything's a nail. To an atomist, everything's a particle. If you can't count it, then it doesn't exist, because today's scientists are not scientists at all. What they are mathematicians. They don't believe in anything. Their belief system is based upon things you can count. You got 50 marbles in the bag or 100 marbles, and you count the marbles. That's how they think. We're living in a new age, nouveau atomism. It's been around for many thousands of years, by the way. It just keeps reoccurring because everything moves in cycles. Everything old is new again. Kind of like bell bottoms when I was growing up was a complete joke. That's what people in the 60s and 70s wore. And now Bell bottoms made a resurgence, not anymore, but everything comes in cycles. So, light does not move. Light is not a particle. It's not a wave, and scientists love to talk about waves. But waves don't exist. A wave is not a thing, rather what a thing does. There's no such thing as a wave. Nobody on this earth can point to a wave. I've said this thousands of times in at least 1,000 different videos. There's no such thing as a wave. A wave is not what a thing is, rather what a thing does. There's no wave-particle duality of light. Mother Nature doesn't do dualities. The very nature of the denotative term duality implies inherent contradiction. There are no dualities in Natura Naturans or Mother Nature, so it's completely impossible. Light does not have a speed. Sure it does. Speed of light. C. That's not a speed. Let's talk about what that is in just a second. Let's just actually define it now. It's the hysteresis, or the rate of induction of the loss of energy and the saturation of the ether by the ether. By the way, of course, people keep saying is light in the ether? It's not in the ether. It is the ether itself. It's not an emission. Everybody on this earth, including me for a significant portion of my life, because that's what we were taught, but I knew it was wrong. It didn't make any sense. It's not an emission. When you flip the switch on a light bulb, nothing emits light. Now, if you think I'm new or novel on this, Walter Russell said this, Nikola Tesla said this, Eric Dollard said this. It was hinted at by Charles Proteus Steinmetz in his second book to his students. I forget it's a 2-volume set. I forget the title. It's downloadable on archive.org, as well as an enormous amount of other texts written by Charles Proteus Steinmetz. Eric Dollard said the same thing. When I actually turn on this laser, sure, it's an emission, speed of light. But it's not an emission. It's the rate at which the ether perturbation saturates. What this specifically is, and I actually posted up a thing on this, is the ether hysteresis constant. But it's not a constant because it changes. When the disturbance occurs in glass or water, it slows down drastically. It depends on the medium, of course. All you have to do is just ask a scientist how light speeds back up after it leaves glass or after it leaves water, without breaking the law of conservation of energy. For something to speed up, kind of like a car, you got to put your foot on the pedal, you got to burn some gas to speed up, right? Say, excuse me, Mr. Scientist, how does light speed back up after it leaves glass or after it leaves water without breaking the law of conservation of energy? They can't give you any explanation. It's completely ridiculous. It's impossible. But if you think that light is an emission and it's moving and it has a speed, then you must necessitatively answer that, as these scientists must, but they won't. Well, I could explain it to you, but it'd be too complex for you to understand. So light is not a perturbation in the ether, as I just got done saying, rather a perturbation of the ether. Everything is an ether perturbation modality. That's all a field is an ether perturbation modality. So is light a wave or a particle? Well, waves don't exist. Waves are not things themselves, rather what something does. It's like talking about force. Scientists love to talk about lines of force. Actually, there's 3 things they love to talk about. Lines of force, lines, the force, and waves. None of these things are real. The lines that are actually created, as you see underneath the ferrocell or in the dual slit experiment, are constructive and destructive interference between the magnetic and the dielectric. This is the reason why there's this rarefaction and compression along the propagation of the manifestation and demanifestation of light. These rarefactions and compressions, yes, that's a constructive and destructive interference as to the nature of light between the magnetic and the dielectric. Let's go a little bit deeper on light, and I've spoken about some of these things that I've said heretofore in other videos, but let's just go a little bit deeper. I've explained the magnet and magnetism endlessly. I've written a book about it, which is in the 3rd edition. So hopefully you understand what a magnet is, and everybody loves to talk about the plane of inertia, at least a lot of people do. The loss of that energy manifests, of course, the dielectric. the dielectric's loss of that energy actually being the magnetic field. That same loss of energy, of course, manifests a wrinkle in the ether. There's a specific rate of loss of energy, or inertia, the original definition of inertia, of the wrinkle of the ether. This light, of course, is not moving. Tesla said specifically, light can be nothing other, he said, this is incredibly important, Nikola Tesla said, I've given a lot of thought, light can be nothing other than a sound wave in the ether. Everybody on Earth, just like light, we need to make a perfect analogy here, and talking about light is speed of sound. Let's use the sound analogy, which of course Tesla uses. We all think sound is an emission. When I speak, there is nothing whatsoever that I am emitting. My vocal cords are moving. That's causing a disturbance in the air, made up of oxygen and nitrogen, right? That would be analogous to the ether, yeah? Speed of sound. The speed of sound changes depending on density and or temperature, which are ultimately the same thing, regarding sound. Speed of sound, breaking the sound barrier. I don't know if you ever heard like a supersonic jet or the Concorde. I remember the Concorde when it actually used to fly. It flew overhead and there was this huge crack. It broke the sound barrier. Well, nothing emits sound. This is a perturbation of the medium, that being the oxygen and nitrogen. The speed of sound is the hysteresis, the maximum rate of propagation of the disturbance of the oxygen and nitrogen that we conventionally, of course, call air. Now, this changes depending on the medium or the density. Speed of sound changes if you were in a pure nitrogen environment, which of course you wouldn't survive very long if you were, but I mean, this is demonstrable. It's been tested millions of times. The so-called speed of light. People say, light's a constant. It's like, no, it's not. It changes drastically through water, changes drastically through glass and other medium. Light is no more an emission than is sound, but we all suffer the same delusion that light and sound are an emission. But they are not an emission. They are a disturbance of the medium. The medium, of course, of sound being oxygen and nitrogen, i.e. the air. The disturbance of the medium of light is, of course, the ether. And people say, oh, you talk about this. The ether's been discounted, blah, blah, blah. Mike Wilson-Morley experiment, which, of course, did not disprove the ether at all. Here's the fact. From thousands of years ago, where people were debating the soul and the ether, the two things that they love to debate a lot. There's a million different views on the soul, the transcendent principle of selfhood with a capital S. A million different views on it, theories, so on and so forth. Many are inherently contradictory with one another. The same is true of the ether. When someone says, oh, so-and-so discounted the ether, thousands discounted it, thousands, it's like, which theory of the ether are we talking about? There were thousands of them. Of the ancient world, we only know of about 120 plus theories of the ether, which is a lot. The ether has never been discounted, and neither has the soul. We could debate it and discuss it endlessly, but of course that's just conceptual blathering, logomachy, which is a great word, which just means blathering at the mouth. But which so-called theory of the soul or the ether are we referring to? The ether cannot be discounted because everything is the ether. A magnet rebounds off the plane of inertia, specifically meaning the magnetic field, that toroidal force in motion centrifugal vector that rebounds off the plane of inertia is demonstrable. You can see it in the ferrocell. You can see it using magnetic viewing film. You can see it with a lot of different medium. It's fascinating. It's this bright white line. Yeah. The plane of inertia. It sits at the midpoint between the three-dimensional S-curve, which manifests the toroidal force in motion centrifugal vector of magnetism. It sits right in the middle, always in the middle. Cut a magnet in half. Now each two little sections will have a new plane of inertia. And there's no plane of inertia located there. It sits at the midpoint between force in motion and centrifugal divergence. A magnet rebounds off this plane of inertia, which of course is the ether itself, the plane of rest. It sits at the midpoint between the dielectric, which is the hyperboloid, right at the center of the dielectric actually. Light rebounds off the same plane of inertia. As Nikola Tesla said before, he said light could be nothing other than a sound wave in ether. Nikola Tesla said light can be nothing other than a longitudinal disturbance of the ether. Not in the ether, but of the ether. All fields rebound off the plane of inertia, or the ether. Plane of inertia is nothing other than a demonstrable thing seen, which cannot actually technically be seen. Not only of a transverse electrical magnetic, which is a three-dimensional coaxial circuit of transverse electrical magnetic, and of course rarefactions and compressions of the dielectric. What science calls a photon is extremely easy to explain because Mother Nature is really, really simple. Yeah, we have the manifestation and demanifestation, specifically the constructive and destructive interference between the magnetic and the dielectric. We'll actually see these pulse perturbations which manifest and demanifest. There's more of them and they're much, much smaller because the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. You think larger light would be more dangerous, right? Like radio and even near visible infrared is super huge. Like some of the largest radio frequencies are hundreds of thousands of kilometers long. Well, that has to be more dangerous. It's super, super huge. Actually, it's the least dangerous. The most dangerous stuff is the smallest stuff. Gamma radiation is, I think, something like 1/3 the size of a hydrogen atom, the actual spatial component. The smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. As far as explaining ether hysteresis and the ether constant, it explains it perfectly. Interestingly enough, however, it doesn't matter if it's infrared radiation or gamma radiation, because all of these in a vacuum, in a perfect vacuum, which even human beings have never created a perfect vacuum, but in a perfect vacuum, they're all C. Nikola Tesla himself pondered and said aloud, how is it that the intensity of the power of the sun could have the exact same speed as a lit match? You know, because a lit match is endless gazillion trillion times less powerful than the sun, but how is it that it emits light at the exact same speed? It's impossible, it's illogical. Unless you understand nature, unless you understand what light is. So light is not a particle, it's not a wave, there's no such thing as a wave. A wave is not what something is, rather what something does. It's not a wave-particle duality, nor could there be any dualities in nature by definition. That's inherently contradictory, illogical, and asinine. Light does not have a speed. This is the ether hysteresis constant, C. Light changes this C constant exactly the same way sound does, depending on the medium and density of the oxygen and nitrogen. The C constant is not constant. If the perturbation is occurring at or in glass or water, it changes drastically. Try explaining Cherenkov radiation. Nothing travels faster than C. What if it's already traveling? And light does not travel at all because we're still using these same ridiculous words, traveling. It's the hysteresis of the ether. This is the rate of induction, the maximum rate of induction of the manifestation and demanifestation of the coaxial circuit that is light. Why does light move at C? Here's the question. Because as soon as light is manifest due to the loss of energy or inertia, isn't that interesting? Because the loss of energy or inertia, i.e. the same as the dielectric manifests the magnetic field, the loss of energy manifests light. Isn't that neat? Specifically, if you want to think about it in a loose term, light is like a non-corporeal magnet. It has electrical, and of course electrical is phi times psi equals Q in Planck of electrification, i.e. the hybrid conjunction of the magnetic and the dielectric. This is the position not only of Dollar, but it's said in page 14, I believe, of Electrical Discharges, Waves, and Impulses by Charles Proteus Steinmetz, who explained it brilliantly. That book was written in, well, it was actually published in 1917. Even over 100 years ago, things were completely messed up in that people didn't understand electricity. In other words, light itself is nothing other than a non-corporeal or incorporeal magnet. Isn't that fascinating? That kind of makes Mother Nature really, 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 really simple. Makes it simple to understand. You have to think about it, of course, but magnet rebounds off this plane of inertia. The transverse electrical and magnetic rebounds off this as well, and we also, too, have the constructive and destructive interference of this so-called photon, but it's not a photon at all. It's not a particle because we're not atomists. We're rationalists. Yes, we think logically. We understand Mother Nature. At least we strive towards that goal, of course. That is where the photon comes from. To think a photon actually exists is as stupid as thinking, throw a rock. You ever seen a water droplet where you actually drop a rock in the water and the actual water has surface tension, which is the hysteresis of the water, because it can only move so fast, no matter how big the rock you drop in it. And the same is true of light. No matter how powerful the light is, it's still, in a vacuum, is C. Whether it's gamma radiation or infrared or radio. When you actually drop the rock in the water, there's a splash. Of course, we can't see it. It's happening so fast. You've seen these before. There's countless stroboscopic images of the water droplet where the water tensions itself, and for a brief period there's this perfect, all by itself, which is spherical due to water tension, this perfect little droplet. Now, what would we call that? Would we be stupid enough to call that a water photon, or a wonton? Wonton, there we go. Wonton, of course, is something you eat. Like, here it is, like, if you're a true atomist and you take this absurdity to its max, it's like, look at that. There's a new particle discovered in water. It's called the wonton. Like a water particle. This is ridiculous, as thinking that photons exist. It's ridiculous. We have this three-dimensional, this coaxial circuit of light, a transverse electromagnetic, and longitudinal rarefactions and compressors, and scientists, which are atomists, actually. Look at that! It's a photon! Look at that! Look at that! Look at that! It would be, you take these same people and splash water. Of course, they're not unintelligent enough to say that, but along their same reasonings, well, if that's a photon, then this is a waton. I'd say wonton or waton. A water particle. That's completely ridiculous. It's illogical, it's nonsensical, it's completely absurd. All of these things that we think about light, even I grew up with, but I knew it was wrong. Light can't be an emission. It has no speed, it's not a particle, it's not a wave-particle duality. And yet, superficially, you might be thinking, well, that's just completely ridiculous. Why don't you spend the better part of a lifetime thinking about light like I have, and tell me something contrary to this? Maybe you think Nikola Tesla was wrong. He said light can be nothing other than a sound wave in the ether. That means light is an ether perturbation modality. Specifically, it's a compound ether perturbation modality, which is what any field is. Light does not have a speed. It is not an emission. A light bulb does not emit light. Do you think if a person like me is in the middle of a big old pond and I start flapping my arms in the pond and generating disturbance in the water that I'm emitting anything? Of course I'm not. Well, of course you're not. You're just flapping your arms, creating waves in the water. Waves of what? Water. This is ridiculous as thinking any light bulb or this computer screen is emitting anything. It's not emitting anything. It's creating specifically a longitudinal disturbance in the ether. Specifically a compound one, a coaxial circuit. I don't know if you know what the cross-section of a coax cable looks like, but you could Google it. People say, what does coaxial mean? You know, coax cable that feeds your satellite dish and your TV and all these electrical devices in your house. I got a coax cable back here, but currently it's plugged into the computer. Look up what the cross-section of a coax cable is. You have the center conductor, and you have the rebounding shell for the electrical and magnetic component to stay within itself and to be less lossy. It's a coaxial circuit. Light is extremely simple, and yet human beings have complicated it to the point of absolute ridiculous absurdity. But maybe you think Nikola Tesla was wrong. I think Eric Dollard said, I'm going to not quote him perfectly, but I'm quote him pretty perfectly. He says, like, when you kick on a laser, you're creating a saturation effect in the ether, which, of course, is accurate. Specifically, he should have said, not in the ether, but of the ether. This is where the devil is in the details. There's no light in the ether. Light itself is the ether itself under disturbance, compound disturbance. Yeah? Like ice, water, and steam. Aren't ice, water, and steam the exact same thing? Those are different things. One's hard, one's wet, and one's vaporous. And I was like, no, they're all water. There's no distinction between magnetism, the dielectric, electricity, and so-called gravity. These are all one and the same thing, ether perturbation modalities. Specifically, there's only two things. Ultimately, there's only one thing, that being the ether, of course. But the dielectric and magnetic, electricity is a compound of magnetic and dielectric. 5 times psi equals Q Planck of electrification. And so-called gravity is nothing other than non-point source mutual mass acceleration. There's no distinction between so-called magnetic attraction, which does not exist, and you pull your hand out of a box that has styrofoam beads in it, and the styrofoam beads are stuck to the bottom of your hand. That's the exact same thing we call gravity. Light is not a wave or a particle. Understanding these things is fundamentally simple. We must embrace Occam's razor from the standpoint of natura naturans, or Mother Nature. Light is not all this ridiculousness. Waves, particles, dualities, photons. It's ridiculous. It is completely ridiculous. Explaining the dual slit experiment becomes abundantly simple. You can't do a dual slit experiment and talk about light because it starts out with a false supposition as to the nature of light. Well, you do the dual slit experiment. How do you explain it? So before we do the dual slit experiment, first we actually have to understand what light is. All these people want to talk about the dual slit experiment. Let's talk about the dual slit experiment. I get asked that stuff all the time. Well, why would we do that when fundamentally you have no clue what light is? You start out with a million false suppositions as the nature of light. It's an emission, a wave, particle, speed, blah, 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 blah. You can't do the experiment if you don't actually know what it is that you're testing. Pretty sure the dual slit experiment is about light, which of course it is. Anyway, these are things to think about, because everything I was taught and you were taught in school are ridiculous. Not from my position. They're untenable. They're illogical. They go against what Tesla said, Dollard said, Charles Proteus Steinmetz, on and on and on. They fail at everything, including Occam's razor. They fail against simplicity, which of course is no different than saying Occam's razor. Mother Nature does not have this crazy bag of magic particles. What is a photon? Well, excuse me, Mother Nature. How is it that gamma radiation, which is about 1,000,000 times smaller than infrared radiation, infinitely more powerful? I thought bigger things were more powerful, more dangerous. Just the opposite. Smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. Why would that be the case? Because true power is in counter space. Subspace, zero-point energy. Who cares what you call it? I.e. the ether. This is the simple explanation. Fundamentally, to get a little deeper than that, why gamma radiation, which is 1,000,000 times smaller than infrared radiation, or radio, electromagnetic radiation, is so much more powerful, so much more dangerous. Ask a scientist, excuse me, Mr. Scientist, since gamma radiation is about 1,000,000,000 times smaller than infrared radiation, why is it like 1,000,000,000 times more dangerous and powerful? I thought bigger things were more powerful. You will never get an answer out of them. They haven't got a clue. Just ask them. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. I hope I kept it kind of short and sweet, which is what I tried to do. Thank you so much for watching. If you like these videos, any donation in the description below is always warmly welcome. Or you could tell me how much you hated this video. Thank you.